If this is winning, I'm getting tired of winning. GOP leadership declares that this bill is a victory. But not unless you define victory as adding over $1 trillion in new deficit spending. So really there is a debate, a big debate within the Republican Party. Which is more important? Is it more important to add $45 billion to military spending, or is it more important not to add $1 trillion in deficit to our overall debt? We now have a $31 trillion debt. We're adding over $1 trillion a year, and yet Republican leadership says this is a victory because we're getting more military spending. But it's a victory at what expense? Are we actually more secure? Are we more safe? Is our national security more protected by spending more on the military, or is our national security actually more threatened by incurring more debt? I would argue the latter. $31 trillion in debt is the number one threat to our national security. It's the week before Christmas, and predictably, Congress is considering yet another $1.7 trillion spending bill. We haven't had a chance to see or even read. Last night at 1:30 in the morning, the text of this 4,155-page spending spree was released. If you thought Congress couldn't possibly spend more money than it did last year, you would be wrong. The Omnibus increases spending by 10% compared to last year's budget. You would think that nearly 2 years of 40-year high inflation would create some hesitation. You would think that a looming recession, spurred largely by exorbitant government spending, would give this Congress pause. But instead of taking a minute to consider what a responsible federal government budget looks like, we are instead placed behind the barrel of a gun, forcing us to choose between letting government expire or blindly passing a $1.7 trillion spending package that not only does not balance, but in fact spends over 10% more than last year. How does Congress spend taxpayers' money? Well, here's just a few examples of how your government currently spends money. We found that they spent last year $2.3 million injecting beagles with cocaine. It seems that they were curious, their researchers were curious, despite the pain they inflicted on these dogs, they were curious to know if cocaine causes adverse effects. Guess what? Read the newspaper. Read the news. Look at the addicts across our country. You think you need to inject beagles with cocaine to know that cocaine's a bad deal? $700,000 was spent to study how male parrots attract their mate. Really? We've got people who go hungry in our country. We got people that are trying to get out from behind poverty, and we're spending $700,000 studying how male parrots attract a female. We spent $187,000 to study whether or not dogs help kids cope. Of course they do. Ask any pet owner. Any pet owner could have told you, and we would have saved the taxpayer $187,000. We spent $118,000 to study if a metal replica, a robot of Marvel Comics' evil warlord Thanos, could snap his fingers. $118,000, really. They apparently hired some dude to wear metal gloves and then try to snap his fingers. You know what? They found out that it's impossible to make a snapping sound with metal fingers. So robots of the world, be warned, it's hard to snap your fingers. While we continue to spend ourselves into oblivion, almost every single European nation is working to shrink their deficit. We routinely look to Europe and we say, look how liberal, look how big government, look how socialized, and yet most of Europe actually balances their annual budget. In 2019, 15 of 26 European countries ran budget surpluses. Another 8 European countries ran deficits of less than 3% of their GDP, while here in the U.S., in that same year, our deficit exceeded 6% of GDP. Europe is a glaring example that fiscal responsibility is possible. It's not a pipe dream. In fact, if we just cut our spending to what we spent in 2019, just 3 years ago, we would actually have a balanced budget today. Instead, we have jumped from a deficit that was 6% of our GDP to a deficit that is 12% of our GDP. We are adding debt at an alarming rate. We are adding debt at a greater pace than we ever have in the history of our country. Thankfully, some of our predecessors in Congress anticipated this lack of restraint, and they gave us some guideposts. They gave us some rules. They established guardrails and tools to keep our budget in check. For example, there is a rule called the Statutory Pay-Go Act, or PAYGO for short. It requires that if you have new spending, it has to be offset by cuts elsewhere in the budget or elsewhere in the spending bill. Despite equipping our government with this necessary tool, though, Congress, with almost every budget in recent history, abuses its power, spends like drunken sailors, and ignores the fact that a day of reckoning is coming. Unfortunately, Congress has virtually 100% of the time voted to waive the pay-go requirements. The American people demand accountability for the damage the big government spenders are doing to our families and to our nation's economic well-being. I will not allow my colleagues to escape accountability by hiding behind 4,000 pages of legislative text. I therefore will raise a budget point of order as this bill comes to the floor that will put every member of the Senate on record as to where they stand on fiscal responsibility. Unfortunately, most of the senators, even if they share my sentiments, they know that this point of order will be waived. They think they can quietly vote this way and no one will notice. Well, when American voters finally notice that people here are saying one thing at home and doing another, are promising balancing budgets and promising that deficits do matter, and then come up here and vote the opposite way, one day the American electorate will wake up and vote these hypocrites out. There are many other points of order that can be raised on this. The budget rules are actually of some value if we would actually obey the rules. Some of the people, you see them in their states, they're at campaign rallies, they'll tell you at town halls, they'll tell you on the Senate floor that we absolutely must get spending under control. They'll tell you that the debt is a problem. They'll tell you that it's a terrible way to run government to have omnibuses. It's terrible to put $6 trillion together in one bill, release it at 1:30 in the morning and pass it, and you can read about it and find out what is in it later. I suspect you will find a lot of promises, though, that will be violated as we vote on these pay-go restrictions. Realize that this is the law. The law of the land says you can't do this. Congress, in passing this omnibus, is breaking the law. The statute says very clearly they cannot do this. The only way they actually can evade responsibility is they change the law. They say, oh, well, it'd be embarrassing to get rid of the law. We will waive the law. So we have laws for decades that could actually right our fiscal house and put us on a course towards balancing our budget, and the rules are waived. They disobey their own rules. Congress does a disservice to the economy every time it waives these points of orders. What good are these procedures if they're never upheld? What started as formal guardrails to keep fiscal health of this nation strong is now merely just a messaging tool with no real significance that allows senators to get away with making promises they never intended to keep. That is why, in addition to raising this point of order, I am introducing an amendment to reform our budget procedures by raising the threshold. Let's make it less easy for them to break the rules. Currently, 60 senators can break the rules. Let's make it 2/3. Let's make it 67 senators necessary to break the rules. Why? Because they're bankrupting this country. Both sides of the aisle. There's an unholy alliance between both parties. One party wants more welfare, one wants more warfare. It's either the military-industrial complex or the welfare-industrial complex. But what happens inevitably every year is spending goes up. People come and the journalists question, what will happen? What will happen with Christmas here? The only thing that is known to happen is this body, both parties, will continue to add to the debt. And there is a day when you wake up and the dollar is worthless. Right now, the dollar is losing nearly 10% of its value on an annual basis, but there is a day when it's 10% a day or 10% an hour. Great countries have succumbed to the destruction of currency, and it happens through debt, through deficit financing, and it's coming to us. There is a day of reckoning. Unless we wake up and say enough's enough, we're going to do the prudent and rational thing. We're going to balance our budget. It's time that we take our nation's health seriously, and it's time that we show concern for those who are being damaged and devastated by inflation. The inflation at the grocery store, at the gas pump, who does it hurt the worst? It hurts those on fixed income, senior citizens. It hurts the working class and the poor, those who have most of their expenditures that go towards consumption, towards their food and groceries and gas. People who spend 90% of what they earn on buying the stuff that allows them to live are the people that are decimated by inflation. So if there are people in this body who do care, who do really care about those who are struggling with the burden of inflation, the best way is quit digging the hole deeper, quit adding the debt, and do what even European countries can do, and that's begin to balance our budget.